Alvin Teague had been hanging his whole weight on one steel lever for a quarter of an hour before it occurred to him that the machine was not broken. It was 20 minutes to 2 in the morning. He was 70 years old and alone in his own welding shop with the doors shut against the cold. And that lever traveled 4 inches out of the frame and stopped like it had hit a wall. He leaned into the handle the way a man leans into a gate that is swelled shut in the rain. Nothing moved. He checked the catch block under the grip. He checked the pin. He oiled the slides, worked the 2 levers on either side of it until they swung sweet, came back and pulled again, and the thing stopped him at the same 4 inches, in the same place every single time. It was not stuck. That was what he kept circling back to, standing there in the cold with his hands smelling of kerosene. Stuck has give in it. Stuck creeps and complains and then lets go. This was something else. This was iron lying across iron somewhere down inside a bed of steel bars under the floor of the machine, put there on purpose by men who wanted that particular lever to stop in that particular place. And it had been doing that job since 1911, whether anybody was in the room or not. What he was pulling on was 19 feet of cast iron and polished steel with 36 levers standing up out of it in a row like the ribs of some animal turned inside out. He had bought all 5 tons of it 11 days earlier for $70. The sale was on a cold, bright Saturday, April 11th, 2015, on a place 11 miles outside Corydon. Indiana, Grover Pyle had died the autumn before at 96, and his people were selling the farm off the tailgate of a hay wagon. There was a good crowd for April. The hand tools went well, and the shop equipment went better, and then the auctioneer walked 90-some people down past the corn crib to the machine shed, because there was one lot left on his sheet that he could not describe. Somebody had thrown a tarp over it years back, and the tarp had rotted off in strips. Under it stood a long, low frame of iron on oak skids, black with old oil, wearing 36 years of swallow nests and mouse work, and a fine gray pelt of dust, and those 36 levers standing up in their rank, each one taller than a man's belt and curved over at the top like a scythe handle. The auctioneer called it the depot machine, because that was what the sale bill called it, and then he told the crowd honestly that he did not know what else to call it. Nobody bid. He came down to 50, and then to 25, and then to whatever anybody cared to say out loud, and the silence had that particular quality a farm crowd gets when everybody has already decided and is only waiting to see who is foolish. A scrap dealer named Roy Bick, who buys iron out of 4 counties and had already loaded a hay rake and a stock tank that morning, stood with his hands in his jacket pockets and did the arithmetic out loud for everyone, the way scrap men do. 5 tons of good iron, he said. 2 days of torch work to cut it into pieces a truck will take. A rented gantry to lift it off the skids, and every hour of that spent standing on another man's dirt. He shook his head and said the numbers did not close, and he was not wrong by a nickel. Alvin raised one finger and said $70, and nobody said anything after him. There was a beat of quiet, and then a man near the front said, loud enough to carry, that Alvin had just bought the heaviest coat rack in southern Indiana, and the crowd gave it the easy laugh a crowd gives when the joke is good and nobody gets hurt by it. Alvin laughed too. He was still laughing when he walked over to the wagon to pay. It took him 2 neighbors, a farm loader, and a borrowed gooseneck 6 hours the following Tuesday to get the machine across his shop floor. It took him about 90 seconds after that to understand that he had not bought 5 tons of iron. He had bought the only surviving witness to something that happened at 1:40 in the morning. In sleet, on the 9th of February 1963, and it had been lying under a rotten tarp in a machine shed ever since, waiting for one man in the world to come and ask it a question. If you've made it this far into Alvin's story, hit subscribe, because what happens next is the part I've been waiting to tell you. Here is what he had. Because the levers are not the machine. The levers are only handles. The machine is the bed underneath them. What Alvin hauled home was a mechanical interlocking, the equipment American railroads used to keep two trains from arriving at the same crossing in the same moment, back when nothing out in the country ran on electricity. Every lever in that rank is connected by pipe and rotting to something out on the ground. This one throws a switch. That one drives the lock that pins the switch closed. The tall ones with the different grips pull the signals that tell a train crew whether the road ahead belongs to them. A man stood in a tower in front of these 36 handles in the dark and moved trains through a junction with his hands in his ears and a clock. And underneath, in a shallow steel bed running the whole 19 feet, lie the locking bars. Flat steel tappets, one for every lever, notched and cross-cut and pinned with dogs, every notch filed by hand by a man at a bench who had a sheet of paper in front of him telling him which combinations of levers may exist in this world and which ones may not. Pull them in a permitted order and the bars slide past each other and everything moves. Pull them in a forbidden order and a dog drops into a notch and the lever in your hand does not move and there is nothing your arms can do about it. That is the entire invention. That is all it does. It cannot see the track. It cannot count cars. It has no memory, no opinion, and no idea what a train is. It was built for one purpose only, which is to refuse. Alvin Teague knew what he was looking at before the loader set it down, and that is the only reason his hand went up. The summer he was 17, in 1962, he spent 4 months as a helper to a signal maintainer on the Blue River and Southern, greasing pipe carriers along the right-of-way, packing joints, holding a lantern while a man 40 years older explained things he was not listening to hard enough. He had been inside 2 of these towers. He still knew the smell of one, which is oil and coal smoke and warm brass. And when he got the dust off the builder's plate on the end of the frame that first night, it gave the year 1911, and under the year it gave the name of the place the machine had been built for, and the name was Denbo Junction. Everybody in that county over the age of 60 knows what happened at Denbo Junction. Denbo was not much of a place, and it was a serious piece of railroad. 2 roads crossed there on the flat, a passing siding ran off to the east, and a lead went down to a grain elevator, and all of it was worked out of a 2-story wooden tower with a coal stove on the ground floor and a bay of windows upstairs. 1 man on each of 3 shifts, alone all night in winter, with the sleet coming sideways off the bottoms and nothing between him and a very bad morning except a rank of handles and whatever the iron under them would allow. At about 1:40 in the morning on February 9th, 1963, a southbound freight of 61 cars took the west switch at Denbo at close to 30 miles an hour and split it. 14 cars piled into the siding, tore up 400 feet of track, and put the elevator lead out of service for 9 days. The head brakeman came out of it with cracked ribs, and the engineer walked away with a cut over one eye, and measured against what could have happened on that curve. Nothing happened at all. But something has to have caused it. And the railroad said what caused it was the man in the tower. The finding was dated that April, written and signed by a claims agent for the road named A.R. Coyne, and the sentence half the county ended up knowing by heart said that the operator on duty reversed lever 14 and cleared the eastward home signal before lever 9 was fully reversed and locked. In plain English, he gave a train a green light into a switch that was not yet closed and pinned. It is the one sin in that trade. There is no forgiving it and no explaining it, and no railroad on earth keeps a man who does it. The operator on duty was Ezra Loomis. He was 44 years old, and he had 19 years with the road, which matters more than it sounds, because the pension vested at 20. He was dismissed in April of 1963 with 11 months to go. And for the next 18 years, he said one thing in the same flat words to anybody who would sit still for it. The machine would not have let me. He said it to the union man. He said it at the hearing. Twice. He said it to men on his own street who had already made their minds up, and he went on saying it after they stopped answering, and the trouble with what he was saying is that it was completely unprovable, and it sounded exactly like the thing a guilty man invents. The tower stood until 1979. Then the road pulled it down, and Grover Pyle, who had been the last agent there, bought the contents for scrap money, dragged the interlocking home behind a tractor, and threw a tarp over it, and after that there was nothing left anywhere to ask. Ezra Loomis died in 1981 at 62. He had been sweeping floors at a consolidated school for 11 years by then, and he had a way of standing at the back of the room at ball games. His daughter Nell was still living 9 miles from the junction in 2015, 74 years old, with a shoebox that held the finding, a letter she wrote to the road in 1983, and the reply she got, which was 2 sentences long and perfectly polite. Alvin got a copy of that finding out of the County Historical Society, which holds 4 filing cabinets of the railroad's paper. And he stood at his own bench and read the sentence about lever 14 and lever 9 with the machine those numbers belonged to sitting 15 feet away from him. Then he did the only thing there was to do. He shimmed the frame level to a hair on his shop floor, because a locking bed will not read true if the machine is racked. He flushed 36 years of dust and mud dauber nests out of the bed with kerosene and a bicycle pump. He oiled every tappet he could reach and left it 2 days. He connected nothing to anything, because the locking does not care whether the far end of a rod is attached to a switch or to open air. It only cares about the levers. And then, at 20 minutes to 2 in the morning, he pulled lever 9 partway over the way a hurried man would, left it short, went to lever 14, and pulled. 4 inches. Stop. He tried it 30 times over the next 2 days. He tried it with 9 inch short, then a 1/4 inch short, then short by the thickness of a business card. He tried it fast and slow and with the frame warm and the frame cold. He fitted a 4-foot cheater bar over the grip, put all 190 pounds of himself on the end of it, felt the whole frame start to walk on the concrete, and took the bar off and hung it up, because he had worked out that he was one hard pull away from breaking the only witness anybody had. Then he started bringing people in. The farrier, 2 neighbors, the woman who runs the feed store, who is stronger than any of them, his nephew, who is 31 and lays block for a living. 6 people put their hands on that lever inside a week, and not one moved it past 4 inches, and every one of them said some version of the same thing when they let go. It does not feel like something jammed. It feels like something decided. Alvin was ready to call the newspaper. What he did instead, because he is a careful man who has been wrong before, was telephone somebody qualified to tell him he was wrong, And that is how Chet Van Dever came into it. Van Dever was 81, retired out of the signal department of a railroad that had swallowed 3 others, and he drove down from Fort Wayne on a Tuesday with a canvas roll of small tools and no particular expectations. He spent 4 hours on his knees at that bed with a light and an inspection mirror, and he was courteous and slow and said almost nothing the entire time. Then he stood up, worked the stiffness out of his back, and told Alvin kindly that he had proved nothing at all. He had proved that this frame on this floor today will not permit that sequence. He had not proved it was the Denbo frame. He had not proved the bed had not been recut in the 52 years since, and beds do get recut because track layouts change. A demonstration in a welding shop is not a junction on a February night, and no railroad and no court and no honest historian would take it for one. And then Van Dever asked whether the operator's own account still existed, and Alvin fetched it out of the shoebox Nell Loomis had lent him, and that is where the floor gave way. Because Ezra Loomis's statement, typed and signed in 1963, said that what he pulled that night was lever 11, then lever 6, then lever 18. Van Dever walked to the frame and worked it. 11 came over. 6 came over easy as a spoon because lever 6 is painted white, and white on an interlocking frame means spare. A lever standing in the rank connected to absolutely nothing, kept for a switch the railroad thought it might build one day and never did. And 18, which by then ought to have been free, would not come at all. The man's own story did not work on the man's own machine. He had described pulling a handle that does nothing and then taking a signal the frame would not have given him. Van Dever said the thing he was obliged to say, which was that this did not look like a wronged operator. It looked like a tired one who invented something in a bad week and then said it for 18 years until he believed it himself. Alvin Teague sat down on an upturned bucket in his own shop and understood that he had spent $70 in 6 weeks convicting a stranger twice over. Van Dever stayed 2 more days, and he did not stay for Alvin. He stayed because something at that bed was bothering him, and on the second afternoon he put his light down into it, called Alvin over, and tapped at the tappets with a screwdriver. There are 36 tappets in the bed. 32 of them are one casting, gray and pitted and polished bright at the notches by 100,000 movements. 4 of them, sitting together in the middle of the run, are a different casting altogether. Cleaner metal, sharper edges, a different foundry mark. And on 11 of the old tappets, down in the cross cuts where no hand goes. There is fresh, bright filing. Somebody sat at that bed with a bench file and recut the locking, and whoever it was did not do it in 1911, which meant levers had been added. And here is the thing about adding levers to a frame like that. You cannot hang them on the end. They have to sit where the pipe runs come up out of the ground, so you open a gap in the middle of the rank and drop them in. And every lever from that gap to the right end takes a new number, and every brass number plate comes off and gets restamped, and the whole locking bed is recut to match the new arithmetic. They took a screwdriver to the brass plates that evening. Under the plate on the lever that reads 18 today, stamped into the iron of the lever tail by a man in 1911 and covered over ever since, was the number 14. Under 15 was 11. Under 13 was 9. Everything from lever 5 rightward had moved exactly 4 places. The Historical Society turned up the paper inside 2 days, a work order dated September of 1955, 4 levers added at Denbo for a crossover to serve a new grain elevator lead. 8 years before the wreck. And in the same cabinet, still in its oak frame, was the tower diagram that had hung on the wall at Denbo, the drawing a claims agent would have carried back to the office to write his finding from. It was dated 1938. Nobody had ever replaced it. The road had renumbered the frame and never once renumbered the picture. So the paper was in old numbers. The machine was in new numbers. The two of them had been speaking different languages for 52 years, and in all that time, nobody had ever had both in the same room. Now, line them up. The finding says the operator cleared the eastward home signal, old lever 14, before the west switch, old lever 9, was reversed and locked. On the frame in that shop, those are today's 18 and 13. 18 will not move until 13 is home and its lock is driven, and that particular piece of locking is cut into the original 1911 tappets, not one of which carries a file mark. Whatever the railroad changed in 1955, it did not change that. The act Ezra Loomis was dismissed for could not be performed on that machine in 1963 and cannot be performed on it now by any man alive. And his own statement, the one that made him look like a liar, he gave it in the numbers he used every shift of his life, the numbers on the brass plates in front of him. A.R. Coyne typed it up as related by the operator, with the 1938 drawing lying open on the desk beside him, and he tidied the numbers to agree with his drawing. One afternoon of clerical helpfulness and a man's account of his own night turned into nonsense that followed him into the ground. Translated back, lever 11 becomes 15, lever 6 becomes 10, lever 18 becomes 22. Van Dever pulled them in that order with 3 people watching. 15 came over, 10 came over, and the lock drove home with a sound like a bolt going into a barn door. And 22, the signal, came all the way over, sweet and free and easy, exactly the way an interlocking rewards a man who has done it right. Which leaves the only question that ever mattered. If the levers were correct and the locks were home, why was the switch standing open? Because a mechanical interlocking locks louvers to levers. It locks the operator's hands. It does not know where the rails are. To make the iron out on the ground tell the tower the truth, you have to buy facing point locks and detector bars, and Denbo Junction had been on the list for those since 1957 and had been deferred 4 times, and the Historical Society has all 4 of those pieces of paper in the drawer. At about 4:20 that afternoon, a helper crew backing a cut of cars had run through the west switch and sprung the rotting. Nobody wrote it up. Bent rotting still moves. Ezra Loomis came on at 11 o'clock at night, and his levers went over, and his locks drove home, and 900 feet away in the sleet, the point stood a little better than 2 inches open in the dark. He had also reported that switch as working hard twice that same winter, and the copies of both reports are in the same drawer as everything else. On a Saturday in August of 2015, about 40 people stood in a welding shop outside Corydon. Nell Loomis was 74 and had to be helped up onto the little platform Alvin had built along the front of the frame so that people could reach the handles the way an operator would. They ran the accused sequence first, and 4 grown men took turns being told no by a piece of iron older than the 4 of them put together. Then they ran her father's sequence in her father's numbers. And it went over like water, and the room got very quiet. The Historical Society published the correction that autumn. The successor railroad sent Nell Loomis a letter considerably longer than 2 sentences. The pension is 40 years gone, and no letter brings it back, and she said herself she had never been after money. She had been after 1 sentence, and she got it. The society and a heritage line raised the purchase price over 8 months in $20 bills, church suppers and one state grant, and in the spring they paid Alvin Teague $46,000 for the machine, which is more money than that society has ever spent on anything. He did not haggle, and he did not hold out. He asked for 2 conditions and got both. The first is a brass plate on the end of the frame with the operator's name on it. The second is that any visitor who wants to may put both hands on lever 18 and pull. The frame stands today in a rebuilt tower on the old ground at Denbo. On a stretch of track, a volunteer crew runs excursions over on summer weekends, and the levers are connected to real switches again, which means the locking is doing exactly the work it was filed to do in 1911. Visitors come up the wooden stairs and are handed the story in about 4 minutes, and then they are invited to try it, and most of them do, and every so often one of them puts a boot against the frame and really means it. It stops at 4 inches. It has been saying the same word since 1911 to everybody without fear or favor, and it took 52 years for somebody to come and ask it the question in a language it could understand.